folks. There it is. Tom Cooper is a PhD candidate in atmospheric chemistry from UC San Diego. He is an organizer and campaign lead with the UC Green New Deal Coalition. There you go. And Green New Deal at UCSD, where his activism has led to the exodus of Chase Bank from the UCSD campus and UC's commitment to pursue decarbonization as a system-wide goal. Now he's the campaign lead for UCSD's fossil-free degree campaign to pursue full dissociation between the fossil fuel industry and UC's research, administration, investments, and career services. And on the call, we also have Evelyn Austin, who will be kicking off with the talk today. Evelyn has been the executive director of Change Course, formerly Banking on a Better Future, since its founding in 2021, where she works to support students in advocating for major banks to stop financing fossil fuel projects and projects that violate Indigenous rights through the successful RBC off-campus campaign. She is a former coordinator of the student-led Divest Canada Coalition and an artist in her spare time. So let's welcome both of our speakers, and Evelyn, take it away.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen because I have some slides. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So, hello, my name is Evelyn. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the executive director of Change Course, which is formerly Banking on a Better Future. As was mentioned, I'm a founding coordinator of the Divest Canada Coalition, which is a coalition of student groups across so-called Canada working together, very grassroots, very student-led, all working together to share ideas and share strategies around their divestment campaigns on their campuses. And then I'm a former organizer with LEAP U of T, which is now Climate Justice U of T, and Divestment and Beyond U of T at the University of Toronto. So as a student, I was organizing with those groups, pushing for the University of Toronto to divest from fossil fuels. In my current role at Change Course, we work to support student groups across so-called Canada. We currently support about 14 campuses in advocating for their universities to cut ties with major banks that are financing the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel expansion and projects that violate Indigenous rights. I'm also calling in today from Toronto on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'm an uninvited guest here on Treaty 13 land, and very grateful to be able to do this work. So a little bit about, so this talk is going to be about university connections to fossil fuel funding banks. And I'm just going to go through a little bit about the roots of the tactic, which comes from the university fossil fuel divestment movement. So just as a refresher, if you're attending this, I assume you know most of these things, but just kind of to go back through it, some of the terrible things that fossil fuel companies have done. They've known about climate change since the 1970s and have actively misled the public and sowed doubt on climate science. They spent billions of dollars each year lobbying and donating to politicians to block climate legislation. They're on track to burn more than 5 times the amount of fossil fuels that the world can handle if we are to avoid the worst and most irreversible impacts of climate change. They're making record profits and awarding CEOs with bonuses and shareholders with generous dividends, and they've gained their wealth through colonial and imperialist extraction, war, and turning communities of color into sacrifice zones. So our universities are complicit in this. Again, I think this is more of a refresher. I think if you're attending this session, I'm guessing you're fairly familiar with this, but you know what, I'm going to slow down here. So the way that this works, when we think about our universities and their complicity in the fossil fuel industry and the continuation of fossil fuel expansion and extraction. The university receives donations and revenues through their land holdings, and that gets channeled into a university's endowment fund that then gets invested in real estate, bonds, stocks, or other forms of investments. Those then generate returns, which are used to fund research, scholarships, academic programs, faculty positions, and so on and so forth. And then any excess returns get channeled back into the endowment and reinvested. But as a product of this, oh, sorry, my clicker is all over the place. Um, Traditionally and historically, university endowments are invested in fossil fuel companies, and this kind of furthers the social license of those fossil fuel companies and also means that our universities are both complicit in providing capital to support this industry and are really trapped in a system that depends on this industry in order to function. So a little bit of the pivot and strategy that led to the fossil fuel divestment movement on campuses. Up until around 2015, the primary strategy that the climate world and NGOs and grassroots groups had been using had been to kind of lobby fossil fuel companies to be better, and to try to work with them to adapt their strategies and their policies. And this all kind of came to a head at the 2015 Copenhagen conference, which is largely viewed internationally as a failure. No policies were adopted following that international conference. And the general sentiment coming out of that conference was that NGOs and civil society had tried too hard to sit down at the table with fossil fuel companies and were trying too hard to appeal to these companies and encourage them to kind of basically go against their mandate and go against what it is that they exist to do. So following that conference, the need to kind of take a harsher approach against fossil fuel industries was identified, and that led to the 350 launch of their university fossil fuel divestment campaign in response to this, in response to that conference, in response to the kind of tame approach that had been taken towards advocacy around fossil fuel companies. So the goal was to stigmatize the fossil fuel industry by turning universities against the fossil fuel industry and making a really big public statement from these institutions that are thought to be like thought leaders and heads of research and really kind of pillars of progress in society, and also to tear down the pillars of support of the fossil fuel industry. So generally, it was recognized that a fossil fuel company will never be anything other than what it is. So the takeaway, so instead of trying to encourage the fossil fuel company to basically go against its mandate and do the opposite of what it's designed to do, instead we kind of have to take away what that company or what that industry needs to thrive. So when we talk about pillars of support of the fossil fuel industry, we have the traditional view of power here on the left side. So this is kind of what we're taught in school. We're taught that power flows from the top down. So if you think of this as a fossil fuel company, for example, you might have the CEO of the company at the top and the CFO and the head of the kind of high level executive sitting at the top, and they are in control. They, in theory, hold all the power. They make all the decisions. They get to set the policies that are in place, and they kind of, are the puppet masters behind the whole thing. And then you have, senior management and middle level management, and then you might have general employees, and at the very bottom, contract workers who are like on the ground building the pipelines, operating the machinery, and so on and so forth. And so in the conventional view of power flows from the top down. And so, sits largely at the top, but kind of trickles down through these other levels. But in reality, when we think about grassroots power building, we understand that power doesn't really work like that. And the fundamental flaw here in this diagram on the left is that we are nowhere in this diagram. So if we think about us as students or us as workers or us as people or members of society, we don't have a role to play in this structure. And if we think about it in those terms, we don't have any influence. But we know that that's not the case and that we have a lot of power as young people and as movement builders and so on and so forth. So in our view in the grassroots view of power, and when we think about pillars of support, we recognize that the diagram on the right is more realistic and that power does kind of consolidate and sit in one place, here at the top of this inverted triangle, but there are all of these pillars of support that prop up that industry. And so that might be paradigms or beliefs or other industries, other figures, other prominent leaders, organizations, institutions, and so on and so forth that help prop up the fossil fuel industry's power. So I might just ask folks to share in chat, if you were to do a little brainstorm, maybe you've done this exercise before, what are some of the industries or beliefs or paradigms that support the fossil fuel industry and kind of uphold its power? And there might be a really obvious one based on the first half of this conversation. Yeah, so politicians who take fossil fuel money, OPEC. I actually don't know what that is. Universities. Yeah, so the universities is a big one. So universities, by continuing to invest in fossil fuels, kind of maintain the social license of the fossil fuel industry by saying like we as these like pillars of society agree that fossil fuel companies are good and worth investing in and worth profiting off of. Politicians who take money for sure. Insurance companies and banks that are financing fossil fuel development is a big one. I would also say like the media is a big one. Um, if you think about police and the way that police continue to kind of use militarized tactics to protect industry as it develops, police are very much upholding the fossil fuel industry. Yeah, government officials, art institutions who continue to take donations from fossil fuel companies and then therefore kind of uphold the social license and kind of turn these like fossil fuel companies into patrons of the arts and patrons of culture are all examples. So if we want to turn, so that's a little bit of the context of the background of where this work comes from. And so I came to this work through the divestment movement. But if we want to turn to banks and the climate crisis, I see this as kind of the next stage of the fossil fuel divestment movement, recognizing that the fossil fuel divestment movement on campuses was largely about social license and stigmatization, and less so about material impact on the fossil fuel industry. Because in the grand scheme of things, when universities hold investments in fossil fuel companies, ultimately those are pretty small investments in the grand scheme of things. And when a university sells off their fossil fuel holdings, those just go to market and are bought up by someone else. And it makes sort of a limited material impact on the industry, but it has a really big impact on the social license and impact on sort of general sentiment around how we view fossil fuel companies as a society. But if we look at the banks, banks are some of the largest financiers of fossil fuels in the world. And so this is a screenshot from the Banking on Climate Chaos report that comes out every year and publishes the amount that major global banks have invested or financed of fossil fuel projects in the since 2016. And so this is from 2022. The 2024 report that looks at the 2023 numbers has yet to come out. So this is a little bit outdated at this point. And I will say that RBC, the Royal Bank of Canada here, has actually been bumped to the second on the list because of like a little dispute. The Royal Bank of Canada kind of disputed some numbers and then they got bumped below JP Morgan Chase, but just barely. And so these are the numbers from 2022 of the top 5 banks. You'll see 4 of the 5 are US banks. And the problem here is that these banks are not just investing in fossil fuel companies, but they're providing loans to fossil fuel projects or to new fossil fuel projects. So what will happen is a company like Enbridge will say, we want to build a new pipeline. They'll go to the banks and say, will you give us a loan for this new pipeline? The banks say yes. And then they provide that loan. And then over time, Enbridge pays back the loan with interest. So the bank turns a profit and Enbridge gets to build their new pipeline. And so what we ultimately want to see is banks stop financing these new projects, particularly fossil fuel expansion projects, but over time, fossil fuel projects in general. Because we know that if major global banks were to pull out of these projects, one, it would be a pretty big reputational risk to these banks. It would signal to other investors that these are bad investments that they should steer clear of. And that their time is coming to an end. It would also make things more expensive. It would slow down projects and making it harder to find capital to finance these projects or force companies to self-finance, which would both slow things down and make projects more expensive, which would in turn slow down their ability to keep working. So this is a screenshot from the International Energy Agency, their net zero report from 2021, in which they clearly outlined that a 1.5 degree pathway means no new oil and gas fields approved for development and no new coal mines. And what they really stress in this report is that what this means is that there can be no new investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. So all banks, all financial institutions, all equity firms need to immediately stop financing these projects if we are to meet a 1.5 degree pathway. So the bottom line here is that if we are to stop the flow of oil, we must stop the flow of money to new projects. So fossil fuel companies exist to profit off of new expansion. Targeting them to stop doing exactly what they're doing, what they were designed to do, isn't going to work. And so what we have to do is start taking away what it is, what the resources are, what the institutions that they rely on are to function. So a little bit of a case study on this. So yeah, kind of the bottom line is that these fossil fuel companies are not going to change on their own. They're kind of inherently designed to continue to profit off of, colonial violence, off of extraction, off of the climate crisis. And so they have no invested interest in changing any of that. So we're instead looking to the institutions that have the ability to change and could change within their mandate and trying to put pressure on them to do so. So in Canada, like I said, I'm based in so-called Canada, and so a lot of the context that I'm giving here is Canadian context. On the campaign that I work on, we're primarily focused on the Royal Bank of Canada, who you would have seen in the previous slide is number 2 globally in the world from the 2022 numbers in terms of financing of fossil fuels. And so in Canada, or in so-called Canada right now, the Coastal GasLink pipeline is currently being constructed through unceded Wet'suwet'en territory without the consent of the hereditary chiefs of that nation. So there's been large scale resistance to this pipeline since for the last 10 or 12 years. The indigenous nation on the ground, the Wet'suwet'en, have been resisting. Neighboring nations have been resisting this pipeline and holding blockades. There's been a lot of militarized raids on indigenous camps, and a lot of criminalization of indigenous water protectors who are fighting the pipeline. And so in 2020, there was this call out. It was called Shut Down Canada. It came directly from the Wet'suwet'en and asked that people everywhere all across so-called Canada kind of disrupt business as usual in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en. So there were major protests, there were rail blockades, there was a lot of disruption continuously and from like January 2020 until March 2020. And then ultimately the COVID pandemic or the COVID-19 pandemic, we all ended up with stay-at-home orders, and that kind of crushed that movement a little bit. But since 2021 onwards, support for the Wet'suwet'en and grassroots support against the Coastal GasLink pipeline has been growing again, but this time RBC and financiers of the TC Energy company who is building the pipeline are the primary target. And so what we've seen through the last few years is that TC Energy, who's actually building the pipeline, has a little bit been removed from the narrative. And again, that comes from the recognition that they're always going to do what they're designed to do. They have no interest in stopping this pipeline, but there are other institutions that they rely on who might. And so instead, the Royal Bank of Canada has become the target, which has led to some pretty significant steps, which I'll get into later in the presentation. Just a little note on US banks. US banks seem to currently be backsliding on climate. And so there have been some major wins in the last few years that show that some global banks are taking steps in response to growing grassroots pressure on them to stop financing fossil fuel projects and projects that violate Indigenous rights. US banks, however, seem to be kind of going in the opposite direction. And I say this is someone who doesn't have a major focus on US banks, and so there may be context that I'm not as aware of. But recently, I think it's notable that the US banks left the Equator Principles, and this is a kind of third-party global agreement that a lot of major banks are signed on to that kind of set sustainability standards. And it was also the only third-party agreement that the banks were signed on to that had any sort of reference to free and prior informed consent of Indigenous peoples. And it was problematic because it didn't specifically require free and prior informed consent of Indigenous peoples. It required free and prior informed consultation. But at the same time, it was the only kind of third-party agreement that these banks were signed on to that required any sort of consideration of Indigenous consent or consultation. And so to see them leave is definitely a step in the wrong direction. And then we're also seeing US banks walking back on their commitments to stop financing Arctic drilling, which are commitments that they made in, I think, 2020. And so this to me kind of signals that US banks feel a little bit untouchable, or they feel that they are untouchable. And I think that makes sense, noting that they're kind of, they're in the imperial core, they're the biggest banks in the world. they have a lot of power. And to me, that just signals like a greater need for pressure from grassroots, from institutions, from universities, from students, and so on. So banks and university campus connections. So again, my work is very focused on working with students to target these major banks and to push for them to develop stronger climate policies and stronger policies around financing of projects that impact Indigenous communities. And so one of the reasons that we focus on students is that we recognize that students have unique access to major corporations, to major global leaders, and through and to elites through their campuses. And that comes through connections to like board members who have connections to these big corporations or through major donors. And we also recognize that universities were kind of founded initially as a collective group of students and academics who would historically fairly frequently use kind of their economic and social power to push for changes in cities and countries that they wanted to see. And so we understand that like at the foundation of what a university is, they are sites of change, and that when change happens on university campuses, the world watches. So in terms of the connection to banks, their connection to banks executives through university boards, a lot of boards have, you know, a lot of financial executives on their boards, and that gives them a lot of say over the university. And it also means that what happens on campuses that push back against their choices is really deeply personal to them. Banks will sponsor major campus competitions, research institutions, and certificate programs. So for example, in Canada, the Royal Bank of Canada is funding the Sustainable Finance Institute at Queen's University, which gives them a lot of power in sort of conventional business spaces over the narratives and the research that's being done on what sustainable finance is and what it means, and kind of like allows them to control the narrative to an extent. And they're also funding sustainable finance certificate programs at the University of Waterloo and Wilfrid Laurier University. And they're funding a lot of sustainable finance kind of competitions and programs and educational programs, which again allows them to kind of train young people to kind of to believe what they believe about sustainable finance, or to believe what they want put forward, or the narratives that they want built around sustainable finance and how they are responding to it. Banks will recruit new talent from campuses, and so this is a big one. Banks are constantly trying to recruit the best and brightest from major institutions, and they're constantly in competition with other like consulting firms and tech companies. In Canada, the big five major banks are constantly talking about how they're in a talent war with each other because RBC wants the best students to come and work for them and not go and work for TD Bank. And that competition also exists between like major banks and major like tech corporations. So, like the banks want the best and brightest computer science students to come and work for them and not go and work for Google and create like competing fintech options and things like that. Universities hold banking relationships with major banks. So universities have a lot of money, they have a lot of social and financial power. And so they're major institutional clients of these banks, which give them a lot of say. Banks sometimes open branches on campuses, which means that, they have a presence on campus, and there is sort of a material gain that comes from having students on their campus as customers. And then banks finance sustainable initiatives on campuses to build up their sustainable finance portfolio. And so this is in reference to banks providing financing to like greenhouse gas reducing projects on university campuses as a way to kind of build up their green image. So this is just a quote here from an article called Universities Under Pressure to Cut Ties with Fossil Fuel Linked Banks. And it says that any social license that a university provides to a bank that is propping up the fossil fuel industry is cause for concern. And so a little bit here, I think I'm maybe coming up, I don't know how long I've been talking for. I'll try to go through this quickly, just a little bit of how students and universities are pushing back against fossil fuel banks or fossil fuel financing banks. So in the Canadian context, our primary target is the Royal Bank of Canada as a proxy for all of the other major banks in Canada that are financing fossil fuels. They're all doing it, but the Royal Bank of Canada is the biggest and worst, and they're the second largest in the world, according to the 2022 numbers from the Banking on Climate Chaos report. So as a strategy, what we do is we target student unions, which are student governments and Canadian universities. So they're made up of elected representatives of the student body who are there to represent student interests. And historically, they have a lot of political power as these institutions on campus that represent the student body and represent the student movement. They represent tens of thousands of students across Canada through this structure. And so what we do is we work to target student unions to pass motions to ban sponsorships from banks, to switch their banking institutions, or to close on-campus branches if they have them. And then as an alternative secondary target, in some cases, student unions don't have a ton of connections to banks, or they're not clear connections to banks. And so we'll work with students on campuses and student unions to pressure their admin to break ties with banks on campuses, because admin ultimately do have a bigger say over how banks have relationships and hold relationships on campuses. And so in some cases, we're working with student unions and campus groups to advocate for admin to cut ties. So we're calling on student unions in particular to join a national statement calling on the big five banks to divest from fossil fuels and respect Indigenous rights. We currently have 11 student unions representing over 500,000 students signed on to a letter calling on banks to meet these demands. We're calling on student unions to end any contracts that they have with RBC that allow an RBC on-campus branch to be on campus. We're calling on them to end any sponsorships they have with RBC or any of the big five banks and move to a credit union. And we're calling on them to prohibit the big five banks from sponsoring events on campuses. So just a little bit of the work we've done. We've worked with 17 campus groups across the country, composed of over 200 students, to target fossil fuel funding banks and demand climate justice and Indigenous sovereignty. We've held over 50 actions on campuses, including rallies, banner drops, flyers, tables, marches, artistic protests, and sit-ins on campus branches and in administration's offices, demanding divestment from major banks and demanding that the student unions or the administration break ties with fossil fuel banks. We've met with representatives from 19 student unions to discuss ending their relationships with RBC and other big banks. And like I said, 11 have signed on to this national statement. And we've had some significant wins. We've had 3 student unions commit to moving their funds away from the big banks into credit unions. We've had RBC branches on 3 campuses committed to closing, so they haven't closed yet, but in some cases student unions and in some cases admin have committed to ending the contract when the coming term is up, rather than renewing the lease as they had planned to do. And then we've seen a number of schools ban sponsorships from RBC or big banks, either explicitly through a policy that directly names the banks, or through ethical sponsorship policies that they've developed that kind of develop a more robust framework around who they do and don't take sponsorships from. And it's working. RBC is very scared. We've seen a lot of response from RBC in particular to the student movement. So something I like to flag is that there's a lot of grassroots organizing happening around RBC in Canada and around the we've seen a lot of grassroots energy. We've seen a lot of NGOs campaigning on this issue, but RBC uniquely responds to students, and they continue to reach out to students in a way that they don't respond to other NGOs. They don't respond to other grassroots groups, which to us shows us that students in particular are a demographic that they really care about and that have a lot of influence over how they work. And so, yeah, they've been reaching out and having meetings with student unions, with student groups that are protesting them on their campuses, trying to kind of like mend the relationship and try to better understand what it is that students want from them. I'm gonna go through this really quickly because I think I'm being told I have about a minute left, but in the UK, there's also been some movement happening. So we've seen students in the UK pledging not to work for the big banks. So Barclays is the biggest funder of fossil fuels in Europe. And so there's been a lot of targeting of Barclays. 60 UK universities recently issued a request for proposals from banks to develop innovative cash deposit and money market products that do not contribute to the construction of new coal and gas fired power plants. And I think this is something that I'm curious to watch over the coming months and see how this develops. So basically, they're calling for major banks to come up with a new product for them, so that they can do their banking and operations without having to finance fossil fuel expansion. And so just a few wins quickly. Laurentian Bank is a bank in Canada that in 2021, I believe, announced that it would no longer finance fossil fuel production. And this, they said, was in response to growing demand from customers. HSBC and Barclays have both committed to no longer financing oil and gas. They haven't committed to like LNG or coal. They haven't made commitments there, but this is a step in the right direction. And then recently, RBC in Canada committed to amend their approach to free and prior informed consent, and just has basically, this isn't like the be all end all, and we'll kind of see how this evolves in the next few months. This is a brand new commitment that they made at their AGM a couple of weeks ago, but they have committed to amending its human rights statement to invoke the UN Declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples and use the standard of FPIC that is put forward there in their financing decisions. And they're basically working to better integrate and better assess how Indigenous nations and Indigenous rights are impacted in their financing decisions. And we'll be going through third-party review of those policies, which is it's obviously, again, it's not the be all end all, and we'll see how this kind of comes into play in their financing decisions in the future, but it is a huge step in the right direction. That is a direct response to grassroots pressure, student pressure, frontlines resistance, and investor pressure. So I'm going to stop there and I will pass it to Adam.
Wow, thank you. That was amazing. Yeah, fantastic overview, not just of your work, but like of the whole student divestment movement over the past 10 years. And I'm really grateful to kind of organize and operate within the legacy of that movement, taking a lot of those skills and tactics and organizing philosophy from you all and everyone who participated in that. So I'm going to be talking about the flip side of fossil fuel finance, when money from fossil fuel companies enters universities directly, usually through research funding as well as donations. And I'm at UC San Diego, and I'll be specifically talking about a lot of examples throughout the whole University of California system. And I think a lot of folks are coming here from the UC system, and just so I have an idea, if you can drop your like campus in the chat, I can maybe sprinkle in some fun facts along the way. So we've seen this issue of fossil fuel companies employing what we call the tobacco strategy, funding academic research that obscures the full negative impacts of their product, fossil fuels, either through outright denial in the 70s, 80s, 90s, or through delay tactics by propping up fake solutions and by casting a cloud of confusion over the pathways that we need to get outside of the climate crisis. And so here's a collection of headlines from The Guardian, which has done a really good job documenting this issue over time, from 7 years ago when it was labeled the invisible colonization of academia. And since then, we've gotten some more explicit numbers and more explicit examples. Just last year, some researchers for Data for Progress, as well as Fossil Free Research, did a huge report on 27 universities tracking down $700 million of research funding, with the most amount of money going to UC Berkeley, which is in that photo there. Let me check on the chat. Yeah, folks from Santa Cruz represent. And just this week, they found really explicit examples of the type of benefits that this research funding can buy universities, with researchers at LSU taking direct research directions from Shell Oil after a $25 million donation, and then soliciting being able to bid on curriculum development for the low cost of $5 million, which they put out to other oil majors. And so this money is having real tangible impacts on university research, university teaching, and the influence that these universities operate in the world. Universities are major centers for influencing politicians, influencing policy. And so this fossil fuel money can shape really critical discourse around climate policy. They shape the questions that are asked by researchers, and in some cases, they shape the answers that are found. And they buy reputational influence. They build up a social license to operate, one of those pillars of support that Evelyn described earlier. And they build career pipelines by grabbing the students that we train at our universities and putting them into destructive industries, which are harming people and the planet. And so I'm going to go through each of these and just give an example from some of my campaigning work throughout the UC system, a lot at UCSD. And so fossil fuel money shapes the questions that are asked. And we see a lot of focus in academic research on strategies that prolong the usage of fossil fuels, namely carbon capture, which is like tobacco companies advertising their filters that was supposed to get rid of all of the carcinogens. Turns out they didn't. And now fossil fuel companies are propping up this technology that they promise will allow them to scrub all of their pollution, all of their carbon emissions, and it's not working. As well as hydrogen, which I don't have time to get into a whole talk on energy, but it's a leaky, inefficient battery that blows up. And it's been the really big focus of methane companies trying to propagate hydrogen as a transition fuel away from methane, because 99% of hydrogen is made directly from methane. And so large methane companies like Sempra Energy and their utilities, Southern California Gas, which covers Los Angeles, as well as San Diego Gas and Electric, fund a lot of research at Southern California schools, namely UC Irvine, as well as UC San Diego, to do engineering studies on hydrogen blending, which is when you put in about 5 to 20% of hydrogen in with methane gas, and you promote that as lowering the emissions of gas as an end use. But this technology just prolongs the use of burning methane in homes and businesses and its associated climate pollution and associated health risks. And so they plan to test this for the first time in the real world. It's only been done in a laboratory in the US on UC Irvine's and UC San Diego's campuses. On my campus, they wanted to do it in grad and family housing. On UC Irvine, they wanted to do it in freshman dorms. And so we turned out, we organized, and we got the projects canceled. We didn't get them fully canceled, but we got them back into laboratories where they belong and outside of where people are living. And so here's an example of the fossil fuel industry directly using university campuses as laboratories, as test beds for some of these untested, sometimes dangerous technologies. And then fossil fuel money can also shape research outputs, the answers that are found during scientific inquiry. Here's a case study with our public enemy number one at UC San Diego, the director of a Deep Decarbonization Institute, which sounds like they should be an expert on climate policy and be pushing for a rapid transition to renewable energy. But this is someone who's taken tens of millions of dollars from BP, Shell, or sorry, I don't want to misstate anything. BP, Total Energy, Chevron, Duke Energy, Sempra Energy, San Diego Gas and Electric, and promotes the uses of methane gas as a transition fuel. This professor wrote the decarbonization plan for a regional utility. Turns out he wrote it to maximize their profit margins, and then wrote the County of San Diego's decarbonization plan, which really closely matched the fossil fuel company's decarbonization plan. He didn't report this as a conflict of interest, and now the county is suing our university with him as a part of that lawsuit, or sorry, no, a local group is suing the county over this and embroiling our institution in this issue over conflict of interest, which as a university professor, you should be reporting, but is oftentimes not the case for industry funded energy researchers. And so it can have direct influence. And this isn't just one localized example. This is a systemic bias that can enter into energy policy output. There's a really great paper out in Nature looking at research outputs from fossil funded energy policy centers, namely at Columbia, MIT, and Stanford, which take a lot of industry funding, which were found to be more favorable in their reporting towards natural gas than renewable energy. And when they mention their funders, they really prop up these companies and greenwash their reputations as being climate leaders compared to research institutes that don't take a lot of this funding. And this fossil fuel money and its insidious linkage really buys reputational influence. And the center of this at UC San Diego is our Scripps Institution of Oceanography, a world-class climate research center that invented and maintains the Keeling curve, the tracking of carbon dioxide concentrations over time in the atmosphere, something you'd expect to be at the forefront of climate science, climate solutions, climate justice, is really tied into the fossil fuel industry, with the director of this research institute being advised by 4 fossil fuel executives and many of the professors at this institution taking money from the fossil fuel industry to find and drill for oil in the ocean or to promote policies that favor fossil fuel companies' profit margins. And so this is when our campus group, who once again were kind of existing in the legacy of divestment, trying to find what's our next battleground, what are the next ways that we can reduce fossil fuel companies' social license to operate on our campuses, which are really influential centers, got us thinking about how to run a campaign directly targeting some of these influences to reduce the social license to operate. So with that, I might need to reshare to make sure we share audio. I have some videos from some of our campaigns. I think I need to go into advanced. There we go. And so in organizing, we call this narrative intervention, where we take something that's in the news. This was during COP28 last year, with a lot of news coverage on how fossil fuel companies were taking up a lot of space during that meeting, promoting policies that benefited their business model, when we were sending 30 UCSD students led by that fossil fuel funded professor. And so play this to give an example of what some strategic communication to counter some of the industry influence can look like.
The fossil fuel industry has taken over COP28, and they use the same tactics to influence our climate research right here at UCSD.
In fact, 4 fossil fuel executives are on the Scripps Advisory Board, shaping the direction of our Climate Change Research Center while maintaining industrial ties.
These executives have so much power, they even named a lecture hall after them, and it was still there.
Scripps is sending 30 people to the United Nations COP28. Most of them are there to enact Scripps' mission in understanding and protecting the planet, but some of them are more aligned to the fossil fuel industry.
The fossil fuel industry maintains millions in research partnerships with Scripps professors. Indeed, they sent one of their largest recipients, David Victor, to COP.
We think that it's time for UCSD to cut all ties with the fossil fuel industry. If you think so too, sign our petition and organize with us for a fossil-free degree.
And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the next one, but you can find all of this on our social media pages at UCSD Green New Deal.
The fossil fuel industry has taken over.
And so the last part I want to focus on is fossil fuel money building career pipelines, where a lot of these companies, such as the utilities, are offering a lot of internships, and they fully fund summer internship programs at a global policy school, as well as direct recruitment from fossil fuel industry companies on campus, really targeting economics and policy students as well as engineers. And so this next video I'm going to play for you all is from a protest when ExxonMobil researcher and recruiter came to campus. And we assembled a broad coalition of social justice organizations because our struggles align with a lot of other struggles for social justice. And these companies are polluting real communities as well as exacerbating the climate crisis. And so we found a lot of areas for allyship and coming together with other student groups.
ExxonMobil's got to go!
We say justice, you say how?
We demand divestment now!
There is no reason that our campus should be arming and funding a state that is actively committing a genocide as noted by the International Criminal Court. And there is no reason that we should be welcoming Exxon, which has contributed to death all across the world. Shame!
Shame!
We need to recognize that the oil companies, military-industrial complex, and American imperialism are one and the same oppressive force. We need to stop the American war machine at every front that they put up. Here at UCSD, it starts with their money.
UCSD is supposed to be a public institution that serves its workers, yet they refuse to uphold workers' rights and continue to prioritize profit over their own students, communities, and employees. It is imperative that the labor movement recognize the importance of divestment and the strong links between environmental justice and workers' rights. It is impossible to attend and graduate from this university without supporting the fossil fuel industry. We demand a better university. We demand that UC system disassociate from fossil fuels. When the air we breathe is under attack, what do we do? When Palestine is under attack, what do we do? When our futures are under attack, what do we do? And if we don't stand up to our institutions and demand them to do the right thing, nobody will.
And in general, we found dissociation campaigns to be really highly mobilizing for students because you have really direct examples of fossil fuel influence at our institutions. You have very clear-cut targets, and you can make some small wins along the way. We scare that Exxon recruiter off of campus. He moved his recruitment talk to Zoom, and he fully canceled his talk for the chemistry department that I'm in because we want these companies not to be welcome at our institutions. And so with this, we launched our fossil-free degree campaign, which will now be launching a UC-wide fossil-free degree campaign today during Earth Day, because we believe that students at the UC deserve more than just a degree that equips them for the future. They deserve one that champions a future free from climate catastrophes. And we want to make sure that our degrees are untainted by the corruption and the influence of the fossil fuel industry. And we frame this as both removing influence, but also inviting in and centering climate justice, because we don't want to base a campaign just around taking things away from the university, but also improving the university. And so we do want to ban research partnerships with the fossil fuel industry, but replace funding for impacted labs, some of which are doing really important climate work, through targeted state funding, which we have a precedence for in California. We want to remove all of the current and former fossil fuel executives from campus advisory boards and invite leaders from frontline communities who should have been there all along. We want to stop fossil fuel recruitment on campus and instead promote good paying union jobs that can directly mitigate from the impacts and causes of climate change. And we want to go back and divest the UCSD Foundation because our campus was really slimy and slick. The UC-wide endowment divested, but our little campus endowments never divested. And we want to invest in the local community and sustainable companies instead. And when we fight, we win. And we haven't posted this yet because we've been prepping for Earth Day, but just last week we won a major policy through the UCSD Academic Senate, the policy on public disclosure of external funding, which is the most ambitious transparency policy in the US now. And that does three big things. It creates a research database, publicly accessible, where all externally sponsored research projects will be disclosed quarterly. So that's funding amount, funding title, and principal investigator for that grant, as well as a donor database. And this is really huge, where all gifts of $10,000 or more will be disclosed yearly on all academic unit websites. And so you can see directly the industries and the individuals which are influencing each of our academic centers on campus, as well as behooving faculty to follow the policy that's already there, but this is another reminder to report conflicts of interest and adopt the norm of disclosing all relationships between the funder and the researcher in all public communications around their research outputs and their expertise.
Adam, there's a comment in the chat that might be pertinent to this particular slide. It says, is that policy UC-wide or just UCSD?
That policy is just for UCSD, but we'd love to see it be UC-wide. So please propose it at your universities. And I think there are efforts to make that policy UC-wide in the Academic Senate. And the movement is winning all across the world. We see individual departments like the University of York's Department of Environment and Geography. We see entire universities like VU Amsterdam fully dissociating from any research partnerships with the fossil fuel industry. We see universities like Princeton divesting and dissociating from a subset of fossil fuel companies, in this case, ones that heavily invest in coal and tar sands. And it's really cool that they did divestment and dissociation at the same time. And your university might be next, but to get that, it's not easy. You gotta organize. And this isn't a whole organizing workshop, but I really believe in the momentum theory of organizing, where you need to build up a lot of people power and you need to build up a lot of skill-based capacity in organizations to win the policies that we want that will create lasting change at our universities. Because it's easy to stage a protest and scare someone off campus. It's a lot harder to pass a policy through some of this bureaucracy, and build up momentum and acceptance for academic Senate-wide votes on some of these issues. And so this momentum theory of organizing requires folks to act, to get out there, to get everyday people to see your campaign, hear about your issue, then recruit, absorb those people. A lot of people are going to be doing that today during Earth Day, getting new people in the movement and training them up so they can take further action, further recruitment, and build up momentum to build organization. And so a lot of us are here in the UC, and I'm happy to organize with the UC Green New Deal Coalition, trying to build student-focused faculty, staff, coalitions around passing a UC Green New Deal policy platform, which you can find on our website. It's also in the Library of Congress now, which is super cool, to transform our university and make sure that we're leading the way with confronting the climate crisis. And so today we're launching our UC-wide fossil-free degree campaign with an associated petition, which will give you all a few seconds to scan that QR code or copy down that bit.ly. In order to demand the UC fully dissociate from the fossil fuel industry. We've seen that these companies have a fiduciary responsibility to destroy the planet, and we believe that that inherently is at odds with the University of California's mission. And so we're calling on the UC to cut all ties and completely dissociate now. And so if you're in the UC, if you have any relationship to the University of California or the state of California, please sign this petition. Always be organizing. It's another good strategy. And with that, I want to thank you all. And I think we have about 7 minutes left until the next round of talks with this UC Santa Cruz Earth Day programming. And so I'd love to hear from any folks. If people want to turn their cameras off, we can go into a conversation. We'll turn the cameras on.
Thanks for presenting. And Adam, I don't know if that QR code was working. It said it wasn't sending me to the right site, so maybe you could throw the bit.ly in the chat. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Oh yeah, Kelvin also said that the QR code wasn't working, so that would be good. But Adam just threw it in there, so feel free to click on it there. Yeah, so either put your questions in the chat or feel free to come off mute and ask your question. Give folks a couple minutes. If not, I can throw in some questions. Oh, Sarah, yeah, I see your hands up.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, my laptop is overheating, so I might have my. Sorry. Thanks so much for both your presentations. I was wondering, following on one of the questions earlier, I'm based at UC Davis. I was wondering to what extent the different UC units come together to discuss these issues, because I think that does make the strength of our system is the fact that we have all these different kind of hubs. And I think even though there are many, there's lots of progress to be done always, but I do think that some of the units are pretty well organized and to some extent established, and I think that can definitely only play in our favor.
Yeah, we definitely have a strong presence at UC Davis, especially through Mark Huising. and Fossil Free Davis, the student-based group there, as well as some like CalPERG organizers. There's a big Davis to Chevron pipeline. There's two Chevron executives. I think one of the former CEOs is on a campus advisory board, as well as the presence of a lot of like big agriculture and their associated influence of academic research. And so that's definitely a big priority area. And because of Davis's proximity to Sacramento, we often see a lot of fossil fuel money funding the arts to go towards Davis. And so it's like the only UC where the humanities are funded by fossil fuels, probably because they put on these, nice presentations for politicians to go to. And so even like regional fossil fuel companies like San Diego Gas and Electric will fund like concerts and things at UC Davis.
Anyone else have a question or wish to drop something in the chat? I have oh, go ahead, Sarah, if you have another question.
No, it was more of a kind of general comment. I see the attendance in this chat, and I'm just thinking, to some extent, sometimes it feels a little bit like an echo chamber, and I'm wondering, like, how do we reach more people? Personally, like, I used to be, I did my PhD at Imperial College London in the UK, also huge backing from the fossil industry. I used to be more involved in kind of divestment campaigns, etc. It's really taxing. It's really difficult. Mostly, I found because of the stigma that we get from other students, and I'm wondering how that's maybe diverging a little bit, but like, how do we get more of that student body to be on our side and realize that this is not just some like green lunatics? I think that I see it as a major barrier. And feel free to ignore if there are more relevant questions in this chat.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear from you, Evelyn, if you have any like advice on how to build like a really strong like people power movement and get from, a Zoom room of 5 people and like a scrappy student group to like building momentum.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think this is a conversation we're having also because we work with like, I think currently 14 campuses, and we're seeing a really clear like regional difference in terms of where organizing is happening and where it isn't. So in Canada, for example, we have like really strong presences in British Columbia on the West Coast, and then here in Ontario. But then we see like very little organizing around divestment happening in the prairies, which is more like industry economy based. That's like, where the tar sands are. And then additionally, like the Maritimes, which historically has this like economic model where people in the Maritimes like will go west to work for a season and then come back. And like that's kind of how their economy has been run for a long time. And so this is something we're starting to think through because in like BC and Ontario, where there tends to be like more progressive organizing happening, groups struggle less, but then when we move into like the Maritimes or into the prairies, there's a really critical difference there. And we haven't yet to figure out what the strategy is in terms of like building up support, especially in those provinces where there is a lot of pushback from other students or from people who have like family who are really dependent on these industries. So that's not a good answer, but it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, I'll just say real quickly, I think just a diversity of like tone and tactics has really helped us because you'll get the green lunatics and the direct action folks, and they'll come out to every single protest, but it's going to be a small group on each campus. And so like inviting more like creative, optimistic spaces. Like today, we're hosting a big teach-in that we're expecting to get like a big turnout towards. People come into the climate movement from a variety of directions, and only being like the direct action protest group on campus oftentimes doesn't have those like routes to entry for a lot of other people who might be interested more academically, more emotionally, more spiritually. And so I think just having a diversity of ways you can recruit and bring people into the movement can be really helpful.
I think also what we're seeing is like we're trying to push student groups to be doing more in-person work because I think since the pandemic, like online has become kind of a default and is easier and is more accessible in a lot of ways. So it's important to maintain that. But I think like we're really working with students to like get out there and like canvas and like talk to people, which is something that I think people have a more like I think it feels harder for people now. But I think it's really important.
Is it Tara? Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, Evelyn, you were talking about RBC and how they were like, um, maybe not friendly isn't the right word, but more interested in working with students and like changing things and doing things to meet those needs. And do you feel like that's like um more of like an actual want to like change things for the better, or more out of like a fear that like that they're going to lose that support, or that they want to just make it seem like it's okay? Like how real are those changes versus just like a more of a branding change?
I think it comes from fear. I think it comes from fear of like losing a customer base, of losing like they're in RBC's case, they're like the biggest bank in Canada. They like to see themselves as kind of like running the country a little bit. And so they want to maintain this image that like we have the best and brightest people coming to work for us. And so for that reason, the reputation is really important. I am kind of cynical and don't really think that a bank will ever do something for the right reason. Like I don't think they're ever gonna do something because it's like the best moral option. I think it's always going to be about business for them, but I think for us, it's really about like leveraging that reputational risk that they're facing when it comes to like this student body across Canada suddenly not viewing them favorably as a future employer, as a future bank to bank with. And then I think when it comes to, yeah, it seems that they are particularly interested in students. And I think that that's true of just like any big corporation for all of the reasons that have been named. Um, and then there are factors that play into it, like the CEO currently, a lot of his personal branding, a lot of the work that he's brought to RBC, like, you know, he became CEO because he was just responsible for this big merger between an LA bank and RBC, and that was really what did it for him. But like what he's kind of brought to it, the narrative is that has built is that he's really interested in like helping students prepare for their future and prepare for the future of the workforce. And so in that way, like I think some of the way that they've responded has been formed by this like brand that they've built about like wanting to support young people. And I think that is sort of more of a unique angle to them in particular. Like I don't think you would see that at every bank. And I think like a lot of the campaigning against JP Morgan Chase has shown that like having a CEO who doesn't care just doesn't really like does make a difference. Yeah.
Any final thoughts as we wrap up here? Any words of encouragement you want to leave with our audience members? There's no encouragement.
I think just that students have a lot of power. And I think that like, yeah, I think we're seeing that happen right now with all the encampments that are happening and all of like the massive support that's turning out. But I think, yeah, I think it's a really unique transitional moment that can feel really volatile, but is really, really important, and a lot can happen. And I think, you know, what I've said before, like when change happens on campuses, the entire world watches, and it's a global platform. So it's really important.
Yeah, there's over 100 college campuses today taking an action as part of a Reclaim Earth Day project, taking back Earth Day from like corporate greenwashers and really centering environmental justice, and focusing on our own universities, divesting, dissociating, decarbonizing. And so it's a really inspiring moment to be part of the student climate movement. And I think the most successful climate movements are when you have really strong staff and faculty allyship and like co-organizing, because everyone can access different levels of the university and pull different levels of power, and we're winning really big policy changes. Like we're making a difference. It's not just screaming into the void. Like we really are transforming our universities.
Great. Well, I think we're pretty much at time. So thank you all for being here today. Thanks to our speakers, and happy Earth Day, everyone.
Happy
Cool.
Earth Day. Go to all
Yeah.
Earth Day events on your campus.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Okay.